So firstly, to our audience, welcome, welcome, welcome. This is a really important topic. It's so far for Dying to Know Day, it's our most popular topic to talk about, talking to children and young people about loss and grief. So you're very welcome here. We're very excited to put this on. Personal thanks to the Groundswell team for making this happen. And I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, from which I am dialing in from in Sydney. My name is Jessie Williams. I am the CEO of the Groundswell Project. And if you don't know the Groundswell Project, we've been shining a light on death for the last 10 years. Hopefully for another 10, because as we all know, death is a part of life, and there's an abundance of conversations to be had and to have. Our mission is to really change the culture around death and dying, and to really shine that light into the places where it needs to be shone, and use it to illuminate you know, all of the different elements, because as we always say, 10 out of 10 people are going to die at some point in their life. Thank you very much. So our two beautiful guests, Megan and Elham, are dialing in from Brisbane, and I'm hosting from Sydney. And I don't know how far apart you guys are. Have you worked that out yet, Jill?
We're socially distanced.
Oh, I would hope so.
Yeah.
I would hope so. Are you in the same vicinity, or are you like, because I know Queensland, Brisbane, it's like it's a big place, right?
I'm in the western suburbs, so I'm on the land of the Turrbal and the Yuggera people.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm inner western north a bit.
Okay, so not that close, really.
Not that close, really. Okay. At least you're definitely north from me. Okay. So to this topic, young people in grief, activating conversations around loss, grief, and compassion. So our research at Groundswell shows that most Australians are not comfortable talking to children and young people about loss. And yet most of us will have experienced the death of someone close to us before we turn 16. So that's a bit of a disconnect. And tonight's conversation is one of those conversations where you can join in from an intellectual point of view. You're very welcome to do that. Sit back, have a glass of wine and kind of listen in. Or you can connect with your heart and join in a little bit of a deeper way. And if you would like to join in that way, perhaps there's a child or a young person that you want to have in mind as you're listening into this conversation. And certainly that child or young person could also be yourself, because you were one of those at one point in your life too. So please, in whatever way you want to join in on tonight's conversation, whether it's just toes in the water or fully in, you're very welcome here. I think we've already set the tone for tonight. We're going to laugh and we're going to talk about some hard stuff as well. Groundswell, you know, where we put our effort, you know, we want conversations to be evocative and provocative. So tonight, we're not going to talk about stages of grief or models of grief, though they have a very important role. We're also not going to talk about life stages or development in a specific way. So there's a place for those things, but we're not going to do that on the webinar tonight. What we're going to do is we're going to zoom in to story and experience and critical reflection. And we're going to absolutely make sure that there's time for a good natter and Q&A before we end. So if you've got a burning question, feel free to write it down now to know that it's parked, and you can bring it back later. You can pop it in the chat. That's absolutely fine too. We do have like a moderator who's going to feed some questions, so you don't need to kind of wait for a particular time. So use the chat function if that's what you like to do. We're taking a broad perspective here, so we're not talking about specific, you know, types of death experiences. So we're just going to leave it up to you, our smart audience, to know that there's a lot of nuance in what we're going to discuss. And yeah, kia ora, welcome. Okay, so when Megan and Elham and I were having a bit of a prep chat last week, we discovered that we all liked to swear a lot. And so we agreed that tonight only one person was allowed to use one swear word. And we decided that Megan's probably earned the right to be that one person. So Megan, I was kind of thinking we could have like an award for the moment, you know, that you did it. But anyway, you're very welcome to use it, but you're only allowed to do it once.
and I'm a teacher, so you know I'm aware of when to swear and when not to swear, but I'm looking forward to my one free pass tonight.
That's fantastic. I can't wait. I'll do a little dance when you do it. Okay, so without further ado, I want to welcome Megan Daley. Megan Daley is a teacher, a librarian, and author in Queensland. She is the founder of children's books Daley, a guide for parents and a resource for educators. Her online writing is around the power of story in the lives of young people, and she has a particular interest in grief literature, having lived with the death of her own husband, brother, and aunt in a few short years. Oh, Megan, where's the red wine? Let's have one now. Megan was recently awarded both the Queensland Teacher Librarian of the Year and the National Dronken Librarians Award. Her first book, Raising Readers, is aimed at parents and educators of young children, published by UQP in 2019. Megan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
And welcome Elham Day. Elham is a death care worker and a grief advocate. He is the family support manager at Hummingbird House Children's Hospice, a community palliative care agency in Brisbane. Drawing on years of experience across death care, counselling, community, youth and arts work, Elham is particularly interested in how soulful and participatory approaches to death and dying can animate individual and collective experiences of death, grief and life in the wake of loss. Elham Day, welcome.
Thanks.
And I'm really glad that your Wi-Fi started to work. No thanks to your landlord today. So it's amazing that you're dialing in via your phone. Thank you. So Megan, I wanted to invite you to kick us off, and I think you're going to do a bit of a reading, yeah?
I am. I'm going to read from chapter 14 of my book. My book is about books, but in chapter 14, the title is Reading the Dark of this chapter. And I started writing this book and was contracted to write this book before my husband passed away. And he passed away 2 chapters into me writing it. And so it changed significantly. And not only because I had to put him in past tense then, so first 2 chapters. So it's changed significantly. And I'll just read you a little bit from chapter 14. The death of my wild-spirited, huge-hearted little brother in 2012 shook our lives until we no longer knew which way was up and which way was down. In 2017, my beautiful and incredibly talented aunt passed away, and then mere weeks later, my husband Dan suffered a catastrophic heart attack in his sleep. Our children woke to the news that their beloved daddy had died, and I had lost the other half of myself. My family and I are extremely close, and we are fortunate that we have each other and a village of people who keep us afloat. But the dark is still a journey that is mostly faced alone. No one person can ever comprehend the incredible minutiae of emotions that overwhelm your soul when you lose someone you love. There are lots of young children in my extended family, and they are well aware of the dark side of life. It is hard for us not to feel sad that their innocence has somewhat been taken away from them, but it is impossible for it to be any other way. All we can do as a family is give them the tools to ensure they are resilient, empathetic, and strong and able to deal with the twists and turns of life as best they can. Along with therapy and surrounding ourselves with our village, books dealing with grief and emotions have been very important to my family. And I believe books of this nature are important for all young people in helping to develop empathy, understanding, compassion, and kindness. The light and the dark coexist in life as they do in literature. And we do our young people a disservice if we do not allow them to experience the full gamut of human emotions and experiences through carefully written, age-appropriate books.
Yeah, that is a perfect way to start our conversation. Thank you. Beautifully written, really clear, really practical. I wonder, could you tell us your story, the story of your children's grief?
Yeah, so my husband, his death was very, very unexpected, and I am a teacher at the school at which my children also go to. And my husband Dan was a very big part of the school community, and I've been at the school for a long time. And you know, as a teacher, you are a public figure, and everybody knows you. And so, you know, news of my husband's death spread very quickly, as news of death does spread very quickly. And I was unbelievably, beautifully supported by the primary school community of parents and other educators and colleagues. There was some issues around how the school management dealt with death. And one day when I've got a bit more headspace, clarity around it and time in my life, I would really like to be involved in sort of maybe policy around how schools do deal with death, because, you know, in my situation, a lot of personal history came into play from some people in the community, and that was really hard. So I have been unbelievably well supported, and I certainly know that's not everybody's experience, but there was still some issues. And I'm someone that, like, I talk way too much, and I'm very open about my grief and my loss, and I talk online about it, and I talk at public events about it. I'm very happy to talk about grief and loss, but I don't want to see another member of my school community or another school community go through what I've been through and be very unable to articulate what they need. I was able to articulate what I needed, and I had to in a lot of instances, but I think there's a lot of people out there who are just, yeah, I don't know why I can talk about it so much, but I just can. And I want to be a spokesperson for those people who don't feel they have the just the strength in that moment. They do have the strength, but just in that moment to reach out and ask a school for help.
And look, we grieve as we live, right? Like our personalities don't suddenly change because we're a grieving person, right? So if you're, I suspect you were
once an extrovert, always an extrovert.
That's it. And so I can completely have a thank you for that rich picture. I can imagine that compassion that was pouring out, as you say, from the community. But there's, you know, there was that disconnect there. I wonder, can you tell us a little bit about the perspective from your children? Like, if we could step into their shoes, what might their experience have been through that?
Well, I go back actually to the experience of my nieces when my brother died. I was sort of the first person that went to their school and told them the news of their daddy's passing, and their reaction was very similar to my own children's reaction. I think that for my two nieces and my now two daughters, they've used school as an escape in a lot of ways. I think all four of the children in my life who've lost their daddy want their loss acknowledged, but they don't necessarily want it talked about all of the time. But I think the difference with my nieces were very much encouraged to talk very openly, and they were allowed to tell their school community about what had happened. Whereas there was a little bit of a sense at my school that it was a very sad time, and that, you know, hysteria could be a bit of an issue. And so whilst the conversation certainly wasn't shut down, and I don't want to give that impression, and their classroom teachers and the primary school staff were and continue to be astonishing, but there was this idea that mass hysteria might be something of concern. And also, you know, I'm in such a unique position because I'm also a teacher. So I saw all of the chatter and the emails going on. So I could see that there was some parents who were very concerned that my children's grief would infect their children, and that they didn't want their children to feel sad. So I really needed space for my children to be able to be sad if that's how they were feeling, but also I think my children really just wanted to be happy at school, and they went back to school very, very quickly. Their choice, they wanted to. But I feel like for them, they needed time when it was they just needed space to be whatever they were feeling in that moment. And that's something that everyone's grief journey is really unique. And I think we can get a bit caught up in pathologizing what a grief journey should look like. And sometimes school counsellors aren't experts in the field of grief. And, you know, I don't think we should question the legitimacy of anybody's grief journey, particularly when you're talking about young children, because young children are I was nearly going to swear, very unpredictable at the best of times.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think it's very hard to give a framework for what a grief journey will look like in a small child. And I don't know that a school counsellor necessarily has that skill set. That's not their fault either, but they don't necessarily have the skill set.
So if you could wave a magic wand with some of those adult roles that would have interacted with your children, like if you could do like a Vulcan mind meld on them, what mindset would you have wanted them to have at that time?
I would wanted them to know that there's no right way to do things, but that that there's no right way to do it, but talking about it is really, really important, and connecting with the individual family is really important, and taking into consideration either religious or cultural viewpoints. You can't, this is why I do have concerns about policy around grief and loss in schools, but at the same time, I'm actually teaching a subject at uni at the moment in collection development policy for school libraries. It's a winner. And I actually, as I've been teaching that this semester, I've actually thought, oh, okay, look, I know this stuff about collection development in libraries. It's part of my DNA. But it's been really interesting, me realising that policy actually does develop vocabulary for a group of people around how to talk about something. And so maybe, even though I think policy can then, I think it's got to be fluid and it's got to be looked at, you know, with human eyes and with empathy and with kindness and compassion, I think maybe I wouldn't mind some guidelines or policy around grief and loss and dealing with it in a school, particularly around staff PD. And because so many teachers individuals were amazing, but as a whole, I felt we needed a more consistent approach, because I think that you can't avoid talking about death, unfortunately, in a school community. All school communities are going to face death at one point. It can't be hidden. I would like to say it does not cause mass hysteria. And, you know, I think that we need to maybe just change the way we're looking at things. One of the things that I feel very strongly about is that grief and loss should be talked about and inserted into the school curriculum in subjects like HPE and social and emotional learning, because again, it builds up this vocab and this language around grief. And I also feel very strongly that it's 2020, people. It is not okay anymore to put on this homework sheet, get mum or dad to sign your homework. Like, hello, like we have so many different family setups in the world now. And I just rage whenever I see my children come home with, you know, get mum or dad to sign I'm going to swear again, my homework reader. You know, dad's not here. And that might seem so small, but it is 2020. Let's stop saying to classes, when I read a book to my library class, I always say at the end of it, you know, and I take your library books home, guys, and get someone that you love and trust to read this book with you. It is so simple to change your language, but always talking about mum or dad, it's just those little triggers all the time for children. And I think that's really something that's just a small change, but it's 2020.
Here. And you know, thank you so much. And I the word just kept coming to my mind as you were speaking there too, about the reactions that you had, which is the word capacity. You know, the assumptions that perhaps we make about the capacity of children and young people to cope. And so, Elham, I wanted to bring you in here and maybe kind of bring that word over to you and ask you, where do you think we're making mistakes when it comes to recognizing young people's capacity to deal with grief?
Well, yeah, first, thank you to you both. Really appreciate, what's the thoughts you've shared so far. And I think that some of your experiences, I think, tie in more broadly to, it's kind of like we need to zoom out before we zoom back in to children and their resilience. I think there is absolutely a real difficulty in collective, like, to speak collectively is hard, but let's make some really broad generalizations and talk about Western culture, for example, because I don't want to assume that this is universal, but generally in like highly industrialized or urbanized settings, there's a real fear of dark emotions, is how I would frame it most simply, and a fear of being with inevitable forms of human suffering. And so while it's a natural thing that parents and carers and school teachers would feel concerned around wanting to protect and safeguard children, these are good things, but protecting children to the point of not being able to experience, as you read out just now, to not be able to experience the dark and the light, actually does them a disservice as they're being raised. The within the broader culture, this inability to sit with grief and sadness, but also often what gets straight away diagnosed as mental health issues such as depression or anxiety. These are not in themselves diseases or illnesses, but so often the language becomes medicalized and pathologized, so that those things, that's the only real frame to talk about those things. So I think for me, there's this need to speak around, I'm kind of making up words here, but like the kind of therapization of broader culture. There's kind of any incident or anything that happens now, quick, call the counselor, call the professional. And I'm speaking as a, someone who would have to raise their hand and say guilty as a mental health professional. But I think there's a need to stand back and kind of ask some questions about why it is that there is a vast increase in things like diagnosis of depression and anxiety in younger and younger children, and a growing sense of disconnection. But at the same time, the ways in which we are looking to tend to those things have, one of my mentors is an author and really experienced kind of grief teacher, Francis Weller, and he talks about the grief having been colonized by the medical world, and it's like really strong language, but I think it speaks to the intensity with which that kind of darker side, if we use that, of emotional life has been sort of cornered off. So we really should not be, it's a good thing to interrupt the conversation, I think, about anything to do with human thoughts, feelings, and emotions, where we start to talk in mechanical terms. Any reference to even chemical imbalance in the brain, if you want to talk around, kind of diagnoses type things, there's just so many questions there's mountains and mountains of research now that speaks to that just not standing up as a truth, and the understanding of the internal workings of us as humans, whether we're adults or children, has significantly shifted to realize that the body and our whole beings has much more involvement there. So tied with that kind of inability to sit with the difficult things is also what I kind of can only call this aggressive and relentless pursuit of happiness. And it seeks to imbalance life. It's exported in the kind of plastic pop feel of like North American culture, this kind of like consistent, like you must be great. And it really is, it creeps into this whole self-help, always be better than you are, rather than being able to accept what is. So for parents or adults who are caring for children, there can often be then a kind of, we might say like implicit assumption that anything other than happiness is a problem. And then when things like intense grief or intense sadness come, we need to fix that because it's a problem or some kind of an illness. And so needless to say, I think that's a real issue in the way that we, even before we begin asking the question of what should we do to try and support young people when they are grieving.
You've just beautifully set the context in which grief happens, the context in which these things happen and these reactions happen, and we have to see that. Thank you for expanding. Backdrop again. Hello, I love it. our sense of this topic. Elham, I think our audience would be really curious to hear about Hummingbird House as well from you. Hummingbird House is this incredible space in Queensland where children and young people go with their families to die. What do you notice there for yourself around children and young people and their experience that you'd like us to know about?
Um, well, I think to speak to that resilience of children and young people is probably an important thing to return to. I think the biggest concerns that we often see are not raised by children and young people themselves. They're raised by parents and grandparents who hold a deep concern and worry that their children or young people won't be able to tolerate the sadness and grief. And a lot of my time is spent reframing some of those conversations. While I'm not assuming it's actually about, it's not them, it's you, but often it's not them, it's it's you. It's kind of it's the adult's inability to be with grief. So because we, again, to speak more broadly, because many, like especially white westernized folk, have not been connected to a kind of intact culture that had anything like meaningful rituals or ways of kind of holding these, the celebrations of life, but also the really difficult times in life. Any of the, I don't want to sort of romanticize, and say every indigenous culture has this figured out, but there is a reason for, as long as we have been humans on the planet, that there were rituals that didn't rely primarily on the spoken word to sit with experiences like grief and death. That's why song and movement and dance and kind of being in contact with the earth we used, because it's a recognition that that's the place that can hold experiences like this, not that you could use the words. So one of the things that often comes up in volunteer training or with concerned grandparents or parents is, what's the right words or language? And for me, that is really not, it's not a question that I would encourage people to spend too much time on. The question I would rather say is, how are you grieving now? Or what do you know about grief? And oftentimes people go, not very much, I need to go to a psychologist. Let's slow down. What do you know about grief? What are you experiencing right now? And how is it that you can show up with your grief to the young people in your life or in your community? Because I guarantee you, the way that you show up with grief is going to impact more than the words you have around grief. So in terms of offering support, I would often say, well, let's show up and acknowledge that grief is there, but also for the adults generally, like, let's shut up first as well. A really good thing to do is to ask a child what their knowledge is or what their experience is, particularly in a hospice environment where there's complex diagnoses going on and deterioration of someone's illness. There can be a lot of concern around what children know or what they don't or what questions they have. It's really helpful in pretty much every case to ask the child what their understanding is, because that's going to help you to orient and understand a little bit about what they are sitting with. And so then beyond that, I would encourage people to find meaningful ways of trying to show up to grief, to try and do grief together in their lives, because that will often teach children more than, sitting down and having that quote unquote serious conversation with them. I think grief is serious enough to make sure that we're showing up for it in other areas of our life. And it's one of the hardest things I see is people who are trying to start learning how to grieve as a child or a loved one is dying. Like, it's like a double burden. That's what I mean around this wider cultural poverty that often exists, is there's a whole other secondary layer of suffering I see, that I kind of have some frustration and deep sorrow about myself, because I think that's a part that we could have a lot of influence over shifting and changing. Death will always be with us, but being able to grieve and integrate those experiences more is something I think it's just something we care a lot about at the hospice.
Yeah, it reminds me of a book I read when I was grieving called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. It was like the key that just changed my whole experience, because I was absolutely stuck in a why me, and then it was a why not me, and suddenly everything expanded and I had capacity to deal with it because I became an ant. And it makes me reflect that, yeah, as adults, our job to do is to expand so that we can be curious and open to the children in our lives. Megan, was there anything that let's feel free to chat amongst yourselves, and I'll leave the room. Like, was there something that resonated?
Well, look, I just think I could listen to Elham all day, and he's so calming, and I think there's such quiet wisdom in everything Elham says, and something that I'm not good at being is quiet. And one of my children's counsellors said to me not so long ago that the reason my 12-year-old sleeps in my bed every night and tries to burrow back into my body is because it's the one time in the day where I'm quiet and I'm not expecting anything of her. And she
Wow.
in the kindest way. But you know, it is actually really hard as a teacher and as an extrovert to sit back, to shut up and show up. And one of the finest examples I've seen of it in my own life is the men that have shown up for my children, from my father to my brother to a delightful man who walks my dog every week on a Tuesday night, but he's actually walking my youngest daughter because he lost his dad when he was the same age that Georgia was when she lost her dad. And they don't really talk about grief, but he feels he never really grieved his dad. And you know, it's been 3 years since my husband died, and every Tuesday night that man shows up, and he sometimes, you know, they'll talk about dads and what they miss, but mostly they just talk about dog poo on the side of the road and picking up rubbish and nature. And that getting out in nature with a consistent person that just shows up every week, you know, the people that show up for your children are the ones that they will always remember. And I think that's really important. I can also see on there that there's a couple of parents from my school community, and one of them has talked about how fear of dark emotions can sometimes stem from the adult's personal lived experience, which Elham, you just addressed. I have found for me, and like as I said right at the beginning, I'm not an expert at all. I'm just someone with lived experience, and I guess the experience of my brother's death before my husband's death gave me some idea about, or gave me some advantage, if that's the word you want to use, when I was then dealing with my husband's death. But for me, children's literature was a really great way for me to be curious with my nieces about their grief. And we read a lot, and I've read a lot with my own children, and I've read a lot to the children at my school. And I think that being curious, and I can see that Jill's on there, and Jill, I know I've shared some of these books with you before, but I think that some of these books have given me a language around grief, or have even validated my feelings. I think every child needs to see their life reflected in literature, and things like Michael Rosson's Sad book have, you know, which just says it's okay. It's more than okay to be sad. You are going to be sad a lot of the time. You know, I will use my get out of jail card here. I've got some as a librarian for the last 20 years, I've had many parents say to me they only want their children to read happy books. And, you know, there's this, here's my swear card. There's this series of books which any of you who are parents will know them. There's 200 of them. I call them the colourful fucking fairy books. There you go. But they are drivel personified, but I do talk about them when I'm talking about grief at literature conferences or whatever, because why do we want our children only to read happy stuff? Because like I said earlier, literature reflects the light and the dark in life. And this book here, for example, The Important Things by Peter Carnivus, it doesn't once mention that the dad has passed away or died, but it just talks about, you know, what are the important things that you want to remember about somebody. And you know, and it just develops this, I just think we need children's literature and art and all of those things that we do with young people build empathy, kindness and compassion and vocab. I need to be quieter, but there are also times when it's okay to talk. And I think that we can develop a vocab around grief and loss together.
Yeah, it's that double-edged thing, isn't it? So Ellen was sort of saying, you know, we have this fixation of what do I say because I need to make a speech and I need to set it up and I need to be prepared and I need to like do that thing. And that's like the wrong way of thinking about it. Absolutely. Well, it's a limited way of thinking about it. And at the same time, you know, at Groundswell, that's the most common question we get is, what do I say? And so we find that sometimes it's helped to go, okay, so like the best thing you can say to a grieving person is, I don't know what to say. And if that's your go-to, that's great, because it's not a platitude. It's not
and
this
and
this.
Look at them with sad eyes. I just wanted to punch out the people that gave me sad eyes. I wanted to walk through the school and punch out the people that gave me sad eyes. Do not give me sad eyes.
Yeah, gosh, I'm sure there's lots of people who are dialing in right now who will go, oh, yes. So look, I've got a question. We're going to move into some questions now. Question for Elham. We've recently had a youth suicide in the community. I don't know the family personally, but I'm one family removed. How do you talk about, acknowledge and support others to grieve the suicide of young people? Thank you for your question, by the way, to that person.
Yeah, and there's few types of death. I mean, it's not a hierarchy, but there's a few types of death that just cause such kind of shattering through, you know, community as when someone takes their life, and you know, listening and asking kind of. This will sound a contradictory statement, but kind of listening to what it is that the families around you and that community needs, before you actually use words or ask, could be a place to start. So I don't want to presume that I know anything around the context or the details, but I think sitting in, you know, losses that are sudden, blindside us and kind of absolutely sideswipe the not just the floor from under you. It's like the kind of, you don't know up or down is often how people talk about it. So sometimes the most helpful thing to do might not be to find out which is up and which is down most quickly, is to kind of orient and try and find some points of reference. I don't want that to just sound so abstract and sound like do nothing. But for example, showing up and walking the dog sounds like such a basic and ordinary everyday thing. But if you know there are things in the community where you can step in and kind of assist, then offering to do those. I think not showing up and asking how you can help, I would kind of be wary against necessarily showing. That's what I mean, kind of listening first and checking in with other people. Like if you imagine that bereaved family right at the center, let's not have many people asking them what they need. Let's make sure there's people on the secondary and then the tertiary circles around there, wider out, getting together and kind of sitting in that what I imagine is deep shock and confusion, and then seeing what emerges from there. And depending on how close the community is or the dynamics within the family or what's happening and what that family wants. And let's not expect that they would know at this time either. I think being and sitting in that shock and confusion is trying to think of another word than necessary, but sometimes that might just be necessary to, you know, there's a reason why you don't know what to do right now.
Yeah, so you said blindsided, you know, as you say, and you don't have a choice with that. Like it is something out of your control. So to be a shock absorber. Yeah. And thank you for mentioning that notion of a family in the middle and don't go in there to say, how can I help? Because you're right, it's a crap question. There's a model that we use at Groundswell called the kvetching circle, which speaks to that beautifully. So if anybody wants to Google it, kvetch is the Yiddish word to moan, complain, to have a whinge, to download, so you kvetch outwards and you put comfort inwards with the grieving person in the middle. And I think it's a really useful mental map for when you find yourself in that situation. Thank you for the question. It was from Gretel. Thank you, Gretel. Thank you, Elham, for answering it so beautifully. Either one of you could answer this one. What would you like us to say to the young person who we see later in the street or supermarket about their parent who has died?
I'll jump in there just as somebody with lived experience, and I'd actually like to know what Elham's words on this are as well. But I really like it when people say something to my children, because even though one of my children loves to talk about Dan all the time, one of them has only just now, 3 years on, been able to utter his name, but they process their grief by other people talking about it. I remember somebody saying to me, my daughter who doesn't talk about Daddy, it's okay that she's not talking about him because she's still processing it. And so I really like it when people acknowledge Dan, and I you know, I mean, I certainly said to my school community, to the educators anyway, I'm really happy for you to say, you know, when you've got one of them at the start of a new school year, you know, I know Daddy died 3 years ago or 2 years ago or 6 months ago, as it was, you know, and I'm just here. You don't ever have to talk to me, but I just want you to know that I know. Because also anxiety has come into play for one of my children, and that's been really tricky. And she gets quite anxious not knowing if people know that Daddy has died. And she gets really quite worked up if she thinks somebody doesn't know, but then she doesn't quite know how to articulate that. So I think from an adult perspective, it's really good to say it. And I'm very happy with people saying, I'm sorry your dad died, because a couple of times people have said, I'm sorry you lost your dad. And my younger daughter, I could see the confusion with, is he coming? Do we just look for him? Will he come back? So, you know, for me, the word died has been the most appropriate. Elham, what are your thoughts on that?
Just 2-word answer would be to acknowledge it and acknowledge them. Absolutely, because the risk when that doesn't happen is it further ostracizes people and says, particularly when parents have had a child die, it says, you know, you're too broken, we can't touch this. So at the same time I'm saying the community needs to listen, like let's check in and make sure that there is somebody linked in with the family who is in the immediate aftermath. I suppose I'm going back to the other question, you know, making sure there is someone there who can say, community want to support you, and do let us know if there are things we can do. But in terms of seeing somebody later, or someone you don't even know that well, again, it's not really about the words, it's just about acknowledging it. But a huge part of whether you use sad eyes or whether you use wrong words will be how you've been able to sit with grief in your own experience. The thing you can do today, like tonight, is start to sit with grief and acknowledge and honor the losses you've had in your own life. And let's not chart them up next to each other. Just recognize that all loss is valid, and absolutely every person is going to experience that. And the more familiar we are with it, the less times people will cross the street to avoid bereaved parents, which unfortunately we hear, you know, still happens, and it's just so unhelpful.
It reminds me of some advice that we get from our friend Zenith Virago, who, for those of you who don't know, is she refers to herself as a death walker, and she helps people understand the journey. And she advises to sit down with a cup of tea once a day and think about death just for 5 minutes, as just a practice ritual. Yeah, we've got some advice here that. What was that?
Shout out to Zenith. She's been one of a huge influence and mentor for me. She's been instrumental in where things are up to in Australia with death and dying. She's
she's pretty extraordinary, isn't she? I've got some advice here I wanted to read out from Monica. So my daughter's father, we were separated, passed away suddenly. She is 15 years old, and it's a month fresh today. Wow. And the best support has been the practical support, meals, vouchers, cleaning, helping to get rid of some of the stuff that's not needed, and cleaning up. That help has been extraordinary. Yeah, the walking the dog, that's a metaphor, isn't it, for all of those practical things. It's bringing the soup, it's doing the washing, it's not asking, but just kind of getting stuck in there. And I think, you know, when the heart is grieving, the heart is full. It's fully felt. It's fully feeling. So if somebody puts the wrong load of washing on and mixes up the colours or stuffs something up, there's just this forgiveness that comes out. So it's all.
I'll jump in there and say that I had a mother at the school I work at who I didn't know very well just text me and say, I'll be picking up your washing on a Tuesday and a Thursday. Don't argue, put it out the front, I'm not coming in. And she never came into the house, and the washing was returned, done expertly, with chocolates in pockets for the kids and gin for me. And I eventually said after a few months, stop. And she just said, no argument, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And it went on for 2 years.
That's amazing. I wonder where she learned that from.
She had experience of a family member dying of cancer, and she remembers the people that showed up. and didn't come in and didn't talk. I'm a talker, and even I was done. I just couldn't talk anymore, and I didn't want to talk. And I didn't want people, like a lot of people would come to the house and they were grieving and they wanted to talk about Dan, and I felt like I had to hug them, and I don't want to hug you. I'm the one grieving. I don't want to have to grieve with you. So to the people that said, I'm just dropping something at your door, great.
That's fantastic. They're champions. Yeah, it's, you know, our whole concept of death literacy is built on recognizing the experience that we have, and we learn how to do it through being part of a care network. So social networks of friends that suddenly turn into care networks because something's happened, and they witness it and they see it and they're a part of it and they're profoundly changed by it, and they want to pay it forward for themselves and for others. It's a beautiful ripple effect, but it doesn't happen unless that invitation's there. And so, Megan, you had the wisdom to be so open and welcoming that people could come and do that, you know. So it's kind of a shared skill set, isn't it, of the person in grief to have that kind of invitation there for other people to do their bit. Let's see what else we've got here. So we've got a comment from Deb. Book suggested by Megan provide opportunities for safe discussions with kids long before they personally experience grief and loss. Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? Do you have any?
It does, yeah. And I think that's what I was saying with grief and loss being talked about as part of the school curriculum. And I know as a teacher we keep shoving stuff into the school curriculum, but I think this is one that is sadly lacking. You know, it's too late when the parent in the school community dies, or the uncle of a child commits suicide, or we've had a child die very, you know, it was a very, very sad and long drawn out process of a child dying recently in our school community. It was too late by the time, you know, it's too late when the child dies or the parent dies. It needs to be done right from the get-go. And, you know, there's books written by child psychologists and by people with lived experience that are incredibly appropriate to read to kindergarten age children. It's just all about age appropriateness, but the conversations need to happen before the tragedy happens.
Yeah, yeah. Got a question here from Helen. Oh, it's Helen Proud, my mother-in-law. So there you are. Hello, Helen. Nice to see you raised a very good son who is currently feeding our children. You'll be very happy to know. Are young people encouraged to be part of the funeral arrangements? Maybe, Elham, you could, from Hummingbird House's experience.
Yeah, maybe I could just double that up. There was another question around whether children or young people should see a body or be close to a body after death. Maybe we could just speak to both of those. The first one, obviously it would depend hugely on the circumstances and the nature of the death. If you are able to be somewhere in a supportive environment, you know, that isn't, say, a kind of coroner's mortuary or something like this, then I think those experiences at a hospice, I can speak to that, are, we have never had time in the 4 years we've been open where a family have supported, you know, very young children to spend time with a child or young person's body. We have never found that to you know, never heard feedback that wasn't a beneficial or helpful experience.
Wow.
And the key thing is just to make that an invitation for the young person. Even if you think they might be too young to understand that, just trust that they might be able to let you know whether they want to do that, and that it might be okay that they change their mind. And the same with the funeral arrangements, or particularly speaking at funerals as we get to kind of older young people and teens, that very often providing them with ways to be involved that aren't locked into the adult way of, you know, pulpit, lectern, whether or not there's a religious or faith-based setting. So often still funerals revolve around this eulogizing and speaking, and it will be, you know, according to, like you say, we kind of, how we live, we kind of grieve. Families will find out what's right for them. But if people are looking for, should children come to a funeral or should young people be involved, I think the question to come back is, why wouldn't children be at a funeral, or why shouldn't they be involved? And giving them something to do. So, you know, making cutout hearts or hands or things like this that then people can write messages on, invite invitation more broadly. So again, that the teenagers and young people we have seen participate most actively in funerals has been when young people have shown up and kind of gotten together and stood around and sung, not because that was on the order of service or because we planned to do that, but that was their contribution. So again, that needs to be, space needs to be made for that, and they just need to be told that they're welcome, and expect maybe that might not look or sound like traditional funeral type things as well. There's maybe more I could say around art and music and teenagers particularly, but that's a separate thing. But in short, absolutely involve them and just ask them. And if they say they're not sure or they don't know, then try and be in a position where you have something to offer. You know, we could do this or we could do this. And the internet is awash with examples of creative ways of remembrance. And often young people are really seeking that, a sense of how do I make meaning and how do I show and honor this, often when I don't feel like I have the words or the vocab.
Yeah, beautifully said. It really requires us to have a different model of funeral, don't we? Doesn't it? Like it's, you know, as you said, the pulpit and the casket. We have these Victorian notions from the television or whatever, and if you've got an order of service and a menu there, you've got to kind of squeeze children into some sort of fixed arrangement as opposed to looking for their capacity to actually be creative. We're seeing DIY funerals on the rise, of course, and green funerals and a whole lot of different ways of doing ritual. So it's exciting to see that that's going to grow with children more and more a part of it, I hope. Yeah. Okay, so we don't have any other burning questions that's been fed to me, and we've got 2 minutes left, so that's probably a good thing. That's probably why they're not giving us any more questions, because we have to wrap up. So I think there's two things that come to my mind, and then I'll invite you to make any final reflections or comments. So this conversation where we've really zoomed into, you know, having conversations with children and young people about grief and loss and looking at the whole space. We're doing this in the time of COVID. We're doing this in the context of a pandemic. And so, you know, from my perspective, it's been really, really useful. And I'm really glad that actually we didn't talk about what COVID means, because we all kind of know that, like it's on our news every night. We're just talking, we could have had this conversation 2 years ago and it would have been equally as relevant. So I'm glad about that. That's a tick. One comment I wanted to make in terms of Groundswell is we've offered schools a small micro grant in order to support them to come up with an idea for building a compassionate community. So having conversations about death, dying and loss. We had a few schools sign up during COVID, and we've got more next year to do. So that's a program that we are rolling out for 2 years. So please, if you're part of a school community and you would like to leverage, it's not about the money, it's only $1,000, but it's, you know, it's a leverage point to start a conversation with the teachers and the principal at your school. You can do a memorial bench, you can do a garden, you can have an art show, like whatever it is that makes you guys excited, we want to help you to do that in 2021. So come to Groundswell's website to find out more about that. So I had to get that in. So Megan, we're going to come to you first to just close off. Firstly, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being an extrovert, and thank you for being you. Like, don't change.
Yeah.
Be like Elham.
Yeah. No, trust me, you don't.
No, you don't. Are there any final words or reflections from you, Megan?
I would just love school communities to build a long-term culture of support around the young people that they care for. School communities are large. Grief and loss is a part of them, and I want school communities to take a stand and either develop policy or just have some thoughts and conversations around grief and loss and develop a long-term culture of compassion and kindness.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much. Elham, any final thoughts?
Just an encouragement for people to start where they are, kind of, you know, learning how to raise not only readers but raise grievers as well, like make space for grief. There's so much. I saw it when you were reading your book earlier. I was like, oh yeah, need to say that. There's so much space given to grief therapy, grief theory, to managing, to strategizing, to coping, to, you know, all of these ways of doing about grief. and not space to learn how to grieve. I was never taught this, you know, many of us weren't. And for children and young people, there will be so many times when you feel like, you know, the classic teenage response of like, oh, you just don't understand. That will probably be true, despite your best efforts and despite your best trying and showing up and going, well, I went to this webinar and they said to do this and it's not working. That there's something about that liminal space, particularly for teens, where you won't understand, but trust that young people's, you know, support them with literature, with music, with film, many of those of which you will find offensive and you will worry about. But like, I was the teenager who was listening to black metal and hanging out in graveyards. And this is where, you know, that quote unquote, you know, obsession with death has led me to, is to, you know, supporting people to find, you know, ways of being kind and caring for each other at some of the most difficult times in life. So trust that young people's experiences are valid, and make space for those. And yeah, you won't always know what that means, but that's okay.
Wow. We're so lucky, we, and I say we as in Australia and the world, are so lucky to have you, and I'm so glad to know that you started out hanging out in cemeteries. Kind of makes sense, actually.
Yeah, when people ask you, oh, how did you get into this work, they're expecting some sort of, you know, big, and I'm like, I can't say black metal, and
No.
like, I can't, but it's an integral part.
Right?
Yeah.
I love it. So to everybody listening, thank you. You know, I mean, we could have had a lovely discussion, just the three of us, and it's been absolutely divine, but we know that you've been here with us, and we know that you've been chatting with each other. So you've given an hour to this tonight, and it's amazing. So thank you for joining us. We have recorded it, so we're going to share that if you want to share it with anyone else in your community. And I believe we're going to send an email with book recommendations from Megan, our award-winning
blog post with a lot of books.
A lot of books, I would expect.
And they're excellent recommendations.
Excellent, nothing less. Okay, go and have a glass of wine, you two. Unless it's dry July. What's
Not
the day?
here.
Last night? Last day? Okay. Grants was doing dry July. I think we're finished tomorrow. Anyway, either way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Raise readers and grievers. See ya.